Hello, everyone, and welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. YIVO, as some of you may know, is a special place for the contemplation and celebration of Jewish history and culture. And we're proud to be able to do that in many ways, including book talks. So today, we're pleased to talk about a new publication, Yiddish Paris, Staging Nation and Community in Interwar France by Nick Underwood. And for those interested, the book is available for purchase in YIVO's new online store. So you can head to yivo.org and you can find the link to our online store to purchase this book and also other book talks from previous book talks and other cool YIVO merchandise and things like that. That's a new thing, so we're glad to have that there. So today with us, we have the author, we have Nick Underwood. He is an assistant professor of history and the Berger Nielsen Chair of Judaic Studies at the College of Idaho. So he earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder and held postdocs at the University of Michigan and the University of California, Berkeley. He is also a member of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. And in conversation with Nick today, we have Laura Hobson-Four, who is professor at the Pantheon-Sorbonne University Paris I, where she holds the chair of modern Jewish history and is member of the Center for Social History. She's the author of A Jewish Morsel Plan, The American Jewish Presence in Post-Holocaust France, and Rescue, The Story of Kindertransport to France and America. So thank you to the both of you for bringing your expertise here today to YIVO. I'll hand it over to the two of you to get started. And for everyone who's joining us from all around the world, thanks for being part of the YIVO community. We're really glad to have you here today.
Thank you. So what we decided to do is to start out with Nick giving a brief presentation on the book, and then we're going to enter into conversation after about 10 minutes.
Absolutely. So let me start by, first of all, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to simultaneously try to put a slideshow up. See if I can juggle two things at the same time here. And also, let's see here, we'll share that. We'll start from the beginning. And also, I want to say thank you. Laura, is the screen visible right now? It's telling me that I'm sharing, so I think so. I want to start by thanking, first of all, everyone for being here. It's always wonderful to do these Zoom events and to see the time zones that we can cover. I think we're maybe at 9 or 10 right now, which is pretty exciting. I want to thank Alex Weiser for the invitation for this event, and also to Jane Tazinski and Julia Rothkopf for helping out so much in all the logistics, the preparation, and making me feel very supported in the run-up of this event, setting everything up and keeping everything running smoothly. I really, really appreciate it so much, and it's been really lovely to work with everybody. And I also want to thank Laura for taking the time to be here with us today. I'm really excited about the questions that I know that she will pose, and it's just a thrill to be here with you. A big high five across the Atlantic to you. I'm sharing with you here the first slide. So we have the cover of the book. So just so you all know, I did not realize that YIVO had the book in the YIVO store, so please purchase it from the YIVO store. However, there are alternate ways too. If you do it through Indiana University Press, there is a discount code that they like me to share there at the bottom, which is save30. And also, please take note of my email address on this first slide. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation afterwards for those of you that are interested. If we don't get to questions that you have, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy. I'm more than happy to talk about the thing that I love talking about with you beyond this event. So I invite you to do that. But now we'll get started. And in late December 1919, 50 people met in a cafe in Paris's 3rd arrondissement to create an executive committee for the newly established group, La Culture Juive, or the Jewish culture. Leo Glazer, who we see here on this slide, former Secretary General of the short-lived League for the Defense of Oppressed Jews, was unanimously nominated president. Glazer, poisonous suit and tie and small round wire eyeglasses, declared that La Culture Juive would stand for Jewish unity and that the group would be an outlet where members were, quote, members can learn about everything related to Jews, end quote. One person then stood up and asked about the group's political stance, and Glazer responded, at this moment, it is not about them. Over the next 2 years, La Culture Juive would help create the base from which Yiddish culture in interwar France would thrive. Yiddish Paris, Staging Nation and Community in Interwar France, is the biography of the sometimes forgotten homeland of Yiddishist diaspora nationalism in Western Europe, France, and more specifically Paris. The origins of that flourishing were found at that first meeting of Le Culture Juive, and Glaser was to play a role. He would find himself involved in almost every major Yiddish cultural institution or organization to emerge in France during the interwar years. His apolitical idea would fade through the course of the 1920s and the 1930s, but the idea of creating culture in the Yiddish language that could appeal to all corners of the Jewish street was one that would remain until the fall of the French Third Republic in July 1940. To highlight this particular trajectory of Yiddish culture in interwar France, Yiddish Paris tells the story of Yiddish cultural institutions such as the Kulturliga or the Culture League, the Medem Farband or the Medem Association, and YIVO, and as well as the groups, the events, and performances and meetings that these bodies organized. In fact, Leo Glaser was the secretary of the YIVO Paris office from the early 30s through the late 1930s. This demonstrates how Yiddish-speaking Jews in France tried to create a sense of French belonging that balanced ideals of Frenchness, such as support for the French Republic, and diaspora nationalism, an Eastern European Jewish import that in the French context was an attempt to carve out a culturally autonomous Yiddish language space within the larger French cultural scene. Yiddish culture was certainly produced by Jewish immigrants in France prior to the Great War. But it was during the interwar years that Yiddish cultural production began a more clearly focused attempt to build a diasporic identity that would enable Yiddish speakers to perform both civic Frenchness and cultural Jewishness. Added to this was a clear Yiddishist impulse that within this particular French Jewish community would profoundly shape the form that Jewishness would take. This was a new framing of Yiddish culture in France. Given the fraught politics of interwar France within both the French and Jewish circles, the success of this cultural project relied entirely on Glaser's model. It needed to be apolitical on the surface so that it could bring together the variety of political groups, many of which were antagonistic towards one another, that were active in the 1920s and 1930s in France. For example, by the 1930s, there were active Bundist or Jewish socialist groups, communist groups, and Zionist groups. Although Yiddish culture was often produced by partisans of these political ideologies, it would ultimately bring unity to parts of the Yiddish-speaking community in France. Glaser was a part of a transnational circle of friends that included the writer Sholem Asch and the painters Marc Chagall and Manet Katz and the sculptor Nachum Aronson. After Le Culture Juive disbanded in 1921, Glaser would become active in the Kulturliga Paris, or the Culture League Paris. There were other branches also in Metz and Nancy and Strasbourg, and later the YIVO Paris office. As a delegate at the 1937, as a delegate at the 1937 First International Yiddish Culture Congress, which took place in September 1937 in Paris, he would help found the Paris branch of the Yiddish Kulturverband, or the Yiddish Cultural Association, known mostly by its acronym YIKUF. Here's some letterhead from the Paris office. After the occupation of France, he and others set up the resistance group La Rue Emelot. Glaser's interwar cultural and political trajectory is emblematic of how Paris operated. These activists were politically and culturally minded and all hoped to reconcile their place within both the transnational Yiddish cultural world and the boundaries of the French Republic. I'd like to introduce you now to really the center of Yiddish Paris and Yiddish culture during the interwar years. This is Lancry or Theater Lancry. Located in the 10th arrondissement near the Place de République and the Marais, at 10 Rue de Lancry, informally referred to as just simply Lancry or Lancry, was centrally located in relation to the working class quarters of interwar Paris. It was already a hub of immigrant Jewish activity, however. Renee Poznansky has called it a veritable stock exchange for newly arrived immigrants. You could spend a first night there, find work as a dressmaker or a mechanic in the garment industry, or simply chat and make some new acquaintances, Poznansky has said. The Kulturliga was just one of the many Jewish organizations, including several mutual aid societies or Landsmannschaften that Lancry hosted in its office space. Its theater space, which this is a picture of the theater, also hosted political meetings and a number of Yiddish theater performances during the 1920s and 1930s. Many foreigners found residence somewhere in Paris during these years, and among the Russians, Romanians, Poles, Italians, Belgians, and Spaniards in Paris by the mid-1930s were Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants from across Eastern Europe, a community that had grown immensely in the interwar years. In 1919, there were approximately 80,000 Eastern European Jews in Paris. This number would jump to approximately 150,000 by the mid-1930s, larger than most Jewish communities in Poland, with the exception of Warsaw and Łódź, though about 1/10 of the size of the Jewish population of New York. So we want to kind of put it in perspective of numbers broadly. These Jews would make their new home in a city unlike any that they had lived in before. Even for those hailing from large, bustling cities in Eastern Europe, Paris was a new experience. For some, the challenges for moving to the City of Light was compounded by the seemingly absence of a clearly defined Jewish cultural community into which they could integrate. Indeed, as ostensibly foreign reminders of their French co-religionists' ethnic and religious difference, Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews were not widely welcome into the established French Jewish community at the start. Their response is therefore important for understanding the variety of ways that a global Yiddish culture can develop. Successive waves of Eastern European Jews fled to France in 1905, 1918, 1920, 1922, and indeed after 1933. Each wave left their homeland for different reasons, ranging from political turmoil and exclusion to anti-Semitism, violent pogroms, economic catastrophe, the collapse of empires, nationalism, and the rise of fascism. But they were all pulled to France by its reputation as a land of economic, social, political, or even national opportunity. It therefore proved fertile ground in the interwar years for the development of Yiddishist diaspora nationalism, which was certainly a malleable national ideal. Like other immigrants in interwar France, Yiddish-speaking cultural activists constructed, through the development of their cultural activities, an alternative diasporic French identity, one that I've called Franco-Yiddishness. The organizations that Yiddish cultural activists created would help establish Paris as a Western European hub of Yiddish culture. Recognizing the need for familiarity in a new home, immigrant Jews in interwar Paris adapted their Eastern European diaspora nationalism to fit their new cultural, political, and social context. Parisian Yiddish language newspapers were also a major component tied to these efforts during the 1920s and 1930s. There were both dailies and weeklies. Paula Hyman estimates that more than 130 Yiddish periodicals appeared between 1918 and 1939. The major newspapers were Paris Heint, or Paris Today, and the Neue Presse, or the New Press. Paris Heint was the Parisian outpost of the Warsaw-based Zionist-leading Heint, and it began publication in Paris in 1926 and ran until 1940. Neue Presse was a daily published under the auspices of the French Communist Party, the PCF, and it ran from 1934 to 1939 before going underground. It would publish again after the war from 1944 through 1993. At the same time, this cultural activity was also embedded Yiddish culture, into larger leftist cultural frameworks in France, and the cosmopolitan, international, and anti-colonial character of this broader French milieu made the question of what it meant to be French a particularly pressing one. The French left placed Jewish immigrants under restrictions, and laws made them comparable to colonial subjects. Officially, their immigrant status all but squashed their formal ability to participate in politics, because immigrants were formally barred from political action. Moreover, all immigrants faced constant police monitoring. It's in fact how I know so much about the culture of YIVO, and we could talk about that later. Nonetheless, despite the fact that Jews in interwar Paris held a tendentious social, political, and cultural status throughout the 1920s and 1930s, their cultural activity allowed them a political voice. The French and global political issues of these decades affected how immigrant Jews organized, created, and staged their Parisian Yiddish cultural project. The City of Light was unique in terms of the outlets and forms of Yiddish culture it produced. Significantly, it claimed branches of the Kiev-based Kulturliga, the Vilna-based YIVO, then Vilna-based YIVO, the New York-based Arbeiterring, or the Workers' or Workmen's Circle, and the Linke Politions Arbeiterheim, or Workers' Home, as well as homegrown Yiddish institutions like Le Culture Juive. It hosted also international traveling Yiddish theater and developed local Yiddish theater troupes as well as Yiddish choruses. Paris's Yiddish cultural institutions represented both the old world, the Kulturliga and YIVO, perhaps. Here's some documents from the YIVO Paris office, and the new world, the Arbeiterring. It was a peculiar twist of fate that in a post-World War I era of national and international upheaval, the city of Paris fostered these vibrant expressions of Jewish diaspora nationalism. This was at least partially due to the rise of the Popular Front in the 1930s, which carried with it a brand of left-wing nationalism. The chapters of Yiddish Paris each focus on a particular component of interwar Yiddish culture in Paris: Yiddish cultural scholarly institutions, Yiddish theater, and Yiddish choruses and music. I also pay close attention to 1937, which saw Paris host the World's Fair, which itself housed a pavilion dedicated to Yiddish culture, as well as an international Yiddish culture congress. And these postcards here are representations of the walls. I know that there's many of them and you probably can't see them too well, but these are representations of most of them are representations of what was on the walls at the Yiddish Culture Pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair. During the 1920s and 1930s, Paris supported a Yiddish culture that simultaneously advocated Jewish cultural and political and national, autonomy and French civic integration. Despite political infighting at the top, Yiddish cultural activists were able to subvert party politics by interrogating the role culture played and had in staging their new community. Surely, politics were apparent in even the most politically unaffiliated Yiddish cultural group. However, what set these groups apart from other party organizations was the broader and, albeit still leftist, spectrum of politics that represented in both their programming and their member lists. What infighting there was in the Parisian community was either short-lived or limited to organizational leadership rather than extending to the rank and file. And this bottom-up cooperation defined Yiddish Paris. Just like the woman on the cover of the book, which is taken from a Yiddish language guidebook to the 1937 World's Fair, the Parisian Yiddishist and diaspora nationalist project posed Eastern European Jewish nationalism alongside French republicanism in a surprisingly successful cultural enterprise. And this multicultural experiment broadens our understanding of both the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking diaspora and the boundaries of the French Republic. Yiddish-speaking immigrants in interwar Paris were an ingredient in a figurative French salad bowl rather than a melting pot. Immigrant Jews were a part of the French imperial nation state in that they positioned their national project within the parameters of the French Republic. They did not function independent of the state. In fact, they wanted to be embraced by it. As a result, they fostered this unique Franco-Yiddishness, and that they thought would preserve their national autonomy and guard against the fascists, whom they feared would ultimately destroy this unique national, leftist, and Republican project. And this, and really maybe still is, Yiddish Paris. Thank you, Ashenim Dank, and merci.
Okay, great. So thank you, Nick, for that overview of the book. It's a really interesting book and so important, I just want to add, because we have a need to learn more about the 1930s. We have, of course, David Weinberg's classic study from the 70s. And we have a book by Didier Appelbaum, Les Enfants du Papier, that came out, I don't even want to give the date right now, but towards the around early 2000s, I believe. Mm-hmm. And we have Vicky Caron's book on French Jews faced with Nazi Germany and the German refugee crisis. And in between, for the 1930s, we have other works, but the focus has been largely on anti-Semitism. And you're taking us to a new place in this book. So I want to thank you for that. And also ask some questions just to set up a general context that's both for a larger public so that we can understand a little bit more about who these immigrant Yiddish-speaking Jews were. And so the first question that I have for you is if you could tell us more about how they challenged the previous paradigms of Jewish identity in France. And I'll help get you started, of course, because I'm a professor and I always want to get people started, which is this idea that over the course of the 19th century, French Jews create a new identity, which we use the term Israelite, and we use the term Franco-Judaism.
Yep.
And this identity is very much taking the notion of Jewish ethnicity and turning it into a religion. So there's this process of making it into a religion and separating the private sphere from the public sphere, so that in the end, you're Jewish at home, and you're Jewish at synagogue. But the idea that the public space remain neutral is something that is extremely important in French culture. So I was wondering if you could speak to that and how these Yiddish-speaking immigrants changed that paradigm.
Absolutely. And Laura, I think it's a great question. And I actually wonder if they're necessarily changing the paradigm or building from that paradigm, right? Like what I think is happening is in the 19th century, when we have these kind of new forms of kind of, French Jewish identity, Israelite, French Judaism, also the internationalism that is being built up during the 19th century that, a lot of people have written about, at least 11 others. I think they're really kind of building upon this, right? And I think that the paradigm that is being shifted here, specifically within this particular community, and this is a sliver of the broad spectrum of Yiddish speakers in Paris at this time, is really kind of this introduction of a new brand of nationalism, diaspora nationalism. We could talk a little bit more about that, right? This whole idea that that there's a kind of cultural autonomous sphere that a group could potentially carve out for themselves in a broader national setting. And I think also with that a note of secularism, right? I mean, a lot of the people who are involved in a lot of these programs, they are clearly aware of the religious component of other Jews in Paris, but most of them specifically are secular themselves, right? So I think that kind of they're building on, right? I mean, kind of what's happened in France beforehand sets the stage for this alternative or new brand of thinking about being Jewish in France, coupled with the internationalism, and then this group of Yiddish speakers that really start coming into Paris really around the early 1900s and then through the 20s and 30s, like I mentioned, really kind of add to this this element of diaspora nationalism, secularism, and then also another language, right? I mean, the one thing that is happening that's different here is unlike previous Jewish communities that are operating in French, this is a community that is doing its cultural output in Yiddish, right? A lot of them are speaking French. Leo Glazer is a French speaker. When he applies for citizenship to the French police, and then later tries to get legal status for YIVO in Paris, he's communicating in French. And a lot of these organizations sometimes are even communicating with French speakers. Noted and otherwise, Romain Roland writes to the Kulturliga regularly about some of their events, and those correspondents are in French. They're clearly knowledgeable and working in French, but their production is in Yiddish, right? So this is also kind of a new thing that's happening within this community. But I would actually argue that it's building upon some of what had already happened in France and how some of this is kind of developing. So I think maybe why I say maybe it doesn't necessarily challenge. I think that it kind of shows that the how these movements over the 19th and early 20th century are really in conversation with each other and kind of lending into a potential or a possibility for something like this to happen in France.
But what I find interesting is that going from this very French idea of spheres where the private sphere is separate from the public.
Yes.
And so one can be Jewish at home and one can be Jewish at the synagogue. Here we have Jews coming from the Jewish street. They're really talking about being Jewish publicly, which is really a strong theme in your book. So I find that really interesting. And maybe also the idea of World War I being a turning point, in that when people are discussing the treaties of the new countries that emerge after World War I, the notion of diaspora nationalism is, of course, extremely important in those treaties. right? So.
Yes, it's absolutely the kind of minority rights and everything that comes about from those treaties is very important. And I think that it sets the stage for thinking differently about minority populations. And one of the things that I write in the introduction is, it's oftentimes important to remember that, and I kind of laid it out in the talk here a little bit, that Paris is an international, it's a cosmopolitan city, right? I mean, there are lots of people from various places, not just in Europe, but around the world in this particular setting because of the French colonial enterprise, right? So this is a place, especially after World War I, where these alternative notions of national belonging are emerging, not just within Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jewish migrants, but you're absolutely right that thinking about minorities is front and center. And one thing that I'll say to the point that you made about kind of how being the language component and it being much more public. It's also one of the reasons that I focus so much on culture, right? And I focus so much on theater, because once we start seeing things like the theater and choruses start to be kind of developed, it's when we see this kind of Yiddish kind of sphere really enter the French cultural milieu, right? And I'm talking about a very small sliver, which are kind of leftist French activists who are supportive of migrants in France at this time. And it's this very interesting thing that happens, whereas the Yiddish cultural component is a way for them to try to fit into the French cultural scene, right? I write about theater reviewers who are not Jewish, French socialists, don't speak Yiddish, and they go to the Yiddish theater and they talk about, I don't speak any Yiddish, but this play was some of the best that the French avant-garde has to offer, right? So it's this way.
We need to learn from them on how to understand Yiddish without speaking Yiddish.
Exactly. If you ask Magdalene Paz, who was a Yiddish, excuse me, not a Yiddish, but a French non-Jewish socialist who would review these plays, she would talk about how she would look around and watch the reactions to people, like, are their eyes open? Are they laughing? This is how I could understand how to respond to some of the plays. But I think this kind of secular component really makes it, because it's not about religion, because it's this kind of Yiddishist kind of cultural component really is what helps bring it out into the streets in a way that I think is different than what's happened, especially when we think about the Israelite, because this is kind of shrouded much more into ideas of Jewishness from a religious perspective, right? And I think that that's kind of what's being added here.
Religious and also very French nationalistic in a way that that tries to, especially after the separation of church and state in 1905, and then followed right after by the rehabilitation of Dreyfus, right? So these are moments perhaps where even in the 1920s, people are comfortable talking about Judaism more, but these ideas that we don't show up and announce that we're Jewish to everyone is deeply ingrained in French Jewish culture. And so it's really interesting. But let's shift directions a little bit and talk about politics, because I think it's a really important theme in your book. Can you help our audience kind of get a grasp on the politics in 1930s France? And we're not talking about Republicans and Democrats, right? We're talking about socialists, communists, and something called the Popular Front. So can you tell us about that? Okay. And I have, of course, more to my question, but the follow-up part is, do you think that these Yiddish immigrants were closer to those political circles, the political left in France, than they actually were to the established Jewish community?
Yeah. So the politics of the French Third Republic are, how can I say, they're fascinating, right? And complicated, and especially coming from a system here in the United States that has primarily two parties, it's confounding, right? So the politics of the French Republic are far ranging, right? So as Laura mentioned, there's the communists in the far left, and we have even kind of what some would call fascist groups in France as well, kind of making up the full spectrum of what's available for people to vote for, or at least support during the Third Republic. Specifically, however, to the Popular Front is really a movement that there were a few iterations of it. There's kind of like the spiritual birth, if you will, that some argue begins in France in 34 and 35, and then a more kind of formal, kind of top-down kind of official setting for the Popular Front, which was a cooperative, coalitional center and leftist movement that kind of took hold, not just in France. There were Popular Front governments in Spain and elsewhere. But primarily for what I'm interested for this project, the Popular Front in France, and the politics on that spectrum are socialists. So originally in France there was a socialist party until the early 1920s, and there was a split at a Congress in Tours that kind of established both the French Socialist Party and then the French Communist Party, and then also kind of wrapped up in this too. There's this other political group called the Radicals, who are a center, sometimes center right, sometimes center left, and then kind of within that different factions. And the Radicals, the Socialists, and the Communists by the early late, so 1934 to mid 1930s, kind of start to cooperate politically and establish the Popular Front. At first, it's a movement on the street, kind of a popular movement, Rassemblement Populaire, and then later a formal kind of voting bloc in the National Assembly. So there's kind of a development, but really what it is a coalition of kind of leftist parties, center and leftist parties, that kind of emerge in the 1930s. It's not the first time that this happens in France. There's a lot of kind of like leftist cartels or groupings that exist, but this is really the first time that all three of these kind of left-leaning groups are on board during the Popular Front, which is how and why they're able to win the National Assembly in 1936. And I should say that the Popular Front, to give a sense of how fraught and complicated the politics of the Third Republic is, the Popular Front, which really only lasts from about 1936 to 1938 formally, is the longest running government of the Third Republic, right? So to give us a sense of how tumultuous the politics of this period are. But yes, it's a leftist coalition.
36 to 38, because you said it a little quickly, so
yes.
So I want to make sure that our audience understands that. So basically, if I can step back and maybe oversimplify a little, what we see is that there are really, really divisive politics on the left in France. And since it's a parliamentary democracy, we have then all of this fan of different political views. And what we see is a calming of the tensions between 1936 and 1938. And that's, of course, very much linked to the Spanish Civil War and the need to get the left on the same page so that people can respond to that war.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we see then there's this moment of calm in this very divisive setting, and these let's then bring it back to the Yiddish-speaking immigrants in your study. How do they situate themselves in this world?
So Lauren, this goes back to the other question that you asked, which I apologize for not answering in my excitement of kind of talking about the Popular Front.
Well, it's so complex, I understand. Yeah.
Right, which is that the Yiddish-speaking Jews that I'm writing about, there's the kind of a typical story that, the well-established French Jewish community, and I even mentioned this, does not initially embrace some of these immigrants. And one of the things that I actually say is, to some extent, some of these Yiddish leftist immigrants are not necessarily trying to integrate themselves into that community. They're actually trying to establish themselves within the French Socialist and French Communist parties, and those are the groups that they are trying to align themselves with. A lot of them are coming from either flirtations or absolute kind of involvement with leftist parties in Eastern Europe. And it's the leftist French politics that a lot of these Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews really try to align themselves with. They think that this is a way that they can kind of support the Republic and be a part of some brand of Frenchness that they think that they could belong to.
So we see these strong ties between the political parties and Jews, even stronger for the communists even than the socialists, right? Because the communists create a Yiddish-speaking section of the Communist Party.
That's right.
And we don't have that in the Socialist Party, but we do have these strong connections. And of course, we have this Popular Front gives rise. He's already there, but Leon Blum becomes the prime minister of France, and he is a Jewish socialist, and he is a Zionist, and he openly discusses these identities. One of the most amazing quotes: he's getting booed in the National Assembly I believe it's in the early 1920s, and he says that people are whispering Jew, Jew, and he yells, or he states, "You're trying to insult me, but this is not an insult. This is I am proud to be a Jew, and you can't insult me with this word." And it's a very strong affirmation of Jewish identity in a society that really was not until the 1920s really coming through with this idea that people could be proud to be Jewish, even though people were proud Jews before that, but it wasn't as public. So we see then these really strong political connections, okay, between these left-wing Jews. And would you say then that they're closer to the left-wing parties than they are to the French established community?
I would say at first they certainly...
the Jewish French community.
Yes. No, I would say that, like I said, I think that they are closer, and that is who they are trying to align themselves with, right? It's not necessarily the longstanding French Jewish community, although, people like Leon Blum, Solomon Grumbach, who a colleague of mine, Meredith Scott, recently wrote about, who are kind of French Jewish populations. Some of these, leftist Yiddish-speaking Jews are aware of them, and they think that they are kind of a way to kind of elevate the status of kind of Jewry more broadly within France. And, the French communists always write about Leon Blum, and there's plays that reference Blum either directly or indirectly. So these are figures that are kind of in their mind. And they're also kind of affiliated with the socialists, but like bigger picture, it's these political groups more broadly than the specific kind of like French longstanding kind of Jewish communities that they are trying to align themselves, and they feel very, very connected to them. At least my read, right, of how they're trying to align themselves, right. It's almost always, if they're involved in a political rally of some sort, it's always hosted by, I shouldn't say always, it's almost always hosted by the French Communist Party or the French Socialist Party. And those are the kind of like the outlets that's kind of embrace them and that they feel embraced by.
It's really interesting to see how these Jews then are integrating into French life, and it's through the political system, and that is something that you really show in your book. All right, but there's another context here, the third context that we really need to take into account before we go to questions and answers. And I see already there are 15 questions, so maybe we should make this the last question, which is the context of growing anti-Semitism in the 1930s. And what's this context I think is really important for understanding the forces that are bringing people together and kind of this underbelly of what's going on in your book. And so one important trial that takes place before the 30s is the Schwarzbart trial in 1927. And that trial, I think it's important to talk about it a little bit. Especially because it creates a group that's working against anti-Semitism. They're really trying to fight anti-Semitism, and that's from 1927 onwards. And then we have the Stavinsky trial, which is a trial of a businessman who happened to be corrupt and happened to be Jewish. And that trial is in 1934, and it sparks a wave of anti-Semitism, and also people feel really helped the extreme right in France coalesce into a political force that created a great deal of violence in the 1930s. So you notice that there's a Jewish Popular Front, and that one corresponds with the larger one we just talked about, the political one between the socialists, the communists, and the radicals. Okay, so this Jewish Popular Front emerges a little bit before. And to what extent is that due to anti-Semitism? Okay, and the other part of my question is this paradox. And I think it's a really interesting paradox that extends beyond your period, but to times like today. In times of anti-Semitism, what we see is actually a greater engagement of Jews in public spaces. And we see that in your book. So can you talk about that paradox? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, Laura, I think you're absolutely right that the sentiment that the rise of anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 1930s in France is really kind of a coalescing feature of what's happening here. And, you know, everything that you said about the trial and the rise of a lot of the leagues against anti-Semitism and those organizations. I would even say that the Schwarzbard trial is even why YIVO winds up being in Paris, right? Because it's Elias Cherikover, one of the founders of YIVO, who comes to Paris, who serves on the defense committee for Schwarzbard. And there's a long story there. We could discuss it elsewhere, not important here, but it really is a moment that really kind of like starts to layer and build some of these components that ultimately will kind of contribute to this like sense of unity and sense of action and political action that starts to rise really in the late 20s and then early 30s. And I actually find it's interesting that it's the rise of anti-Semitism that does compel a lot of these kind of Jews to kind of become a little bit more politically active. And, you know, I think that you use the word paradox, and I think that there's a paradox, but also there's kind of, maybe it's also just the logical outcome, which is that what happens, at least I write a little bit about this, is that anti-Semitism starts to be embedded into kind of the larger political project of the left, right? I mean, there's this one, I love talking about the front page of the Neue Presse from July 14th, 1936, which is a statue of Marianne at the Place de la République. It has in French the lyrics to the Marseillaise, so the French national anthem, and then at the bottom it has this picture, this drawing of a protest, and the protesters are holding a sign that says against anti-Semitism, against anti-racism, and against fascism, right? So like the anti-Semitism starts to kind of build kind of this political like sense of urgency, and then it winds up being built into and kind of embedded into some of the larger fears that are happening, especially after February 1934, which is a potential fascist coup, that kind of starts to percolate among these groups, right? So I think anti-Semitism, it's simultaneously, paradoxically, but almost kind of logically gets built into some of these political projects. You know, I mentioned briefly the 1937 World's Fair, and I read also kind of the anti-Semitism weaving into that pavilion, right? Because the pavilion there is really, it's said to kind of show how Jews have contributed to European culture, which I think is a complete response to the rise of anti-Semitism, right? That Jews are a European community that are creating culture, and that in the rise of fascism, that this is an alternative way of thinking about Jewish belonging. And I think that absolutely the anti-Semitism is front and center of a lot of these people's minds and really catalyzes some of their activities.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for this needed context for us to understand all the different cultural projects. And we really didn't talk about them because we don't have time, but let's turn to questions, because there are so many of them. And I mean, I was trying to get a sense of, wow, how are we going to answer all of these? But what we'll do is we'll start from the top and we'll work our way down. Okay. I don't know if you can see the questions, Nick, but the first is from Peggy Frankston. So hello, Peggy. Peggy, we know you very well here in Paris. And Peggy always asks excellent questions. So here's an excellent question. If Leo Glazer's model insisted upon the association being apolitical, how come his archives are part of the French Communist Party documents given to the departmental archives of Saint-Denis in the early 2000s?
Right. So it's a great question. There's also Leo Glazer archives. There are various places we could talk about where I had to go to find some of these materials. So as I mentioned, so Glazer's idea is at least as articulated early on as apolitical. That sensibility shifts. You know, his collection at the PCF, or the French Communist Party archives that are at Saint-Denis now, it's my understanding that they are there because of David Diamant. And I wonder if sometimes they're kind of contextualized in those particular ways, because when I've read Glazer's writing, he does have this still kind of maintains this broad reaching kind of sense of political unity. I think that, you know, he is also kind of active in a variety of outlets. You know, he's involved, like I said, he's involved with YIVO, he's involved with YIKUF, which is of course a leftist organization that exists post-war as well. I think that, his ideas, and just like all these people, their ideas of politics are constantly changing. So for me, it's not incongruent for him in the early 1920s to kind of talk about being apolitical, and then later on in the 1930s start to embrace a little bit more kind of a more an ideology that is more on the communist side of the left. So I think that it's because of how and when some of those materials, the materials that I found from the early 20s, are actually not in Saint-Saint-Denis. They're in the police prefecture archives, because it's kind of where I found those materials.
Right, because the French police has Yiddish speakers, Yiddish moles, right?
Yeah, the Yiddish mole. That's how I know what he said, because it's translated from the Yiddish into the French on the police report.
Right.
Which whether or not we should trust the mole.
We need to question a little bit, right? We need to wonder: did that policeman really speak Yiddish, or was he like the reviewers of the theater performances, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we
exactly.
don't know, but it's really interesting to find these archives in France and to discover the rich archives held by the Paris police. We can learn a lot about Jewish communities through these archives, but through a prism, of course, that we need to take into account as this, we have to really remember who's speaking here. It's the police, and the goal is to study, survey, sometimes repress Jews. And I'm not talking even about the occupation period, but periods outside of World War II. Mm-hmm. Which leads us to the second question. So I'm going to keep you moving, Nick, because we have a long list. Okay. So the second question is, what happened to the girl on the book cover? Did she survive the war? Do we know anything about the woman on the cover?
There are so many people that I have tried to figure out who they were, and I've not been able to figure out. One of the I shouldn't say, how can I phrase this? One of the complexities of putting this project together is that, I'm dealing with institutions that held and had administrative records, or presumably had administrative records prior to the war, right? And during the war, it seems that many of them were lost. I have very little, if any, editorial records from the Naya Pressa. The Naya Pressa is who published that guidebook. It was edited by a handful of people, but I don't have the editorial kind of notes on who is represented there, who was selected. I've tried, and I've showed that image so many times in hopes and, kind of querying about perhaps someone would know who it was. And I still have not had anyone kind of tell me who the person was and what happened to them. There's also, the Naya Press also does this series of course, it's a children's column that's in French. It's not in Yiddish. And there's one young girl who actually was 11 and would write in, and I'm still trying to figure out what happened to Regina, and I have not been able to find it. But it's because of the lack of sometimes the administrative kind of editorial records that I have not been able to find kind of related to this period.
Do you have her name?
From the cover?
Yes.
Or the cover, I do not have the person's name.
Okay. So if you had her name, we could put it out there and see.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If I had her name, it would be easier, but like just based on the image, I have no idea. And for all I know, it's, maybe not somebody from, who knows? I have no idea where they found the image and how they got it, who posed for it, if someone posed it, are they borrowing it from someone? I have no idea.
Okay, so let's move along the list, and we have two questions coming from Sharon Pinchas. So why was Paris an attraction for Ashkenazi Jews fleeing from persecution? And I think that's an excellent question. There's also the question on what were the differences between Sephardi and Ashkenazi communities at this time. So why don't we just do the first question, and it gives time to everyone to ask their questions.
Great. So the first question is that a lot of them start fleeing to. So a lot of the group that comes to Paris after 1933, some of them were in Berlin before, so we can understand why they're fleeing Berlin. The way that the refugee laws kind of existed in France during the French Republic made it a little bit easier for some Jews to kind of come in, and refugees more broadly. There's actually some really great recent work being written on kind of like the politics of the Quai de Valmy, which is the kind of like the Minister of Interior, kind of to some extent in foreign relations. Some of those records, but it has to do with the way how Jews were able to, and refugees more broadly, were able to come into France. And by the 1930s, they're not going to places like the United States because of the immigration quotas that were placed on it. So it was getting more and more difficult to get to places like the United States, and some of whom would have gone on, maybe would have passed through Paris earlier and made their way to the US or other places. But by the 1930s, it's getting more difficult, and a lot of them are kind of attracted to France, right? And France is also kind of like historically imagined as this kind of like land of asylum, and this is kind of like feeding into some of the policies and practices of the 1930s. To the question about Sephardic Jews, I looked very much for some of the overlaps. There's actually police archives about the Sephardic Jews there. There's a population of roughly 30 to 35,000 Sephardic Jews, and a colleague of mine, Robin Buehler, has written a really wonderful dissertation on this and recently published an article in Jewish Social Studies about Sephardic Jewish communities and some of their kind of cultural activities. It's slightly different. Some of the initiatives that they put forth are similar in terms of kind of like integration and cultural institutions, but many of them were French speaking already because of the Alliance Israélite Universelle. So their kind of integration into France is a little bit different, but I highly recommend her work, who's working on Sephardic Jews in Paris in the interwar years.
All right, so I'm faced with a challenge because we have so many questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. So instead of going down the list, I think what I'll do is select some of these questions, and then some you can of course engage with Nick Underwood, the author, via email afterwards if we did not get to your question. And my apologies, but I have to make some choices here today. One of the questions, we have some personal stories. A woman named Peggy Wald, she said, my mother-in-law said her uncle went to Paris in the 1920s from Vilna to study hairdressing. He returned to open his own salon in Vilna. I was wondering how he coped in Paris, assuming he only spoke Yiddish. I'm intrigued that there was a big community he may have connected with. Mm-hmm. Was there the equivalent of today's email list to connect the Yiddish speakers with these cultural events? How do people find out about the events? And try to make a short answer so we can get to.
I'll make a short answer. There was no. Well, I guess if we think of like old school email list as kind of like the events section of newspapers, so all the major Yiddish newspapers were posting events for each other's. Right, the communists were sharing events related to the Bundists or the Socialists, vice versa. So there was a wide array of ways for people to figure out what was happening. Right, YIVO was also sending out newsletters and making their events known. So there was a way of if one was engaged in spaces where they could access the newspaper, and Naya Press had a circulation of, some people estimate around 10,000-ish, so pretty decently sized, that there would have been ways for people to find out about some of the events that were happening. And then, of course, if they would have made their way to Lancry, they would have found a community that would have been inviting and would have been able to point them in which direction to go, either to go to an event on politics in France or to go see a good theater show. So there would have been a lot of outlets for them in the 20s and 30s to figure out ways to kind of get connected to some of the other Yiddish speakers that were there.
Okay, now here's a question on they're great questions. They're really interesting to see when people share their personal histories with this. It's really, I think, really intriguing to see how people ask questions about this period. One question was on immigration laws in France, and did they create a quota system like they did in the United States? Peggy Frankston helped us and answered this one for you, so okay. You're good. The answer is the borders, things became more liberal in France at that moment in time, which kind of redirected the immigration flow to France, which explains why there are more and more, there's more and more Jewish immigration in the interwar period. Right. Okay, so we have also a question on today, Yiddish in France today. Can you talk about the contemporary status of Western Yiddish in Paris and elsewhere? And this is from a three-person setup: Daniela, Isabella, Eva, and Davide.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a thriving, the Medem Bibliothek that I mentioned earlier that was founded by the Bundists in 1928 still exists by way of two organizations these days. There's an Arbeiter Ring and the Medem Bibliothek, or the Centre the Center of Yiddish Culture, right? So there are two lively organizations. The Medem Bibliothek is the largest repository of Yiddish books in Europe, at least from what I have been told. That's what they tell me. And they do courses, events. They also do Yiddish language courses. So does the Arbeiter Ring. I know for a fact the Arbeiter Ring also does public programming, because I've I've seen Laura give a book talk there. So there's a wide variety of kind of activity, mostly kind of being spurred by not just the older generations, but younger generations too. A lot of younger people are going to Paris and the language schools that they're hosting to learn Yiddish, and it's really becoming. I would probably argue that Paris never really went away as a hub of Yiddish culture. I'm actually working on a project based on the post-war years now, and there's a flourishing immediately after the liberation of Paris of Yiddish culture again, and that really kind of really continues to this day. So there's a lot of kind of activity and really excitement for Paris as being a center or a hub of Yiddish and Yiddish language and literature.
Absolutely. And we have the place, it's kind of like the joke, every Jew needs two synagogues, the place where you go and the place where you won't set a foot. And in Paris, we have many different places for learning Yiddish, even in the university system as well. Yeah. We have Yiddish classes. Okay, so there are requests that you add. Okay, we have your email now in the chat, so people can reach out if we're not going to get to your questions, and I'm really sorry. We don't have the time to address all these questions. One question is there still a branch of YIVO in Paris? I'll answer. The answer is no. Okay, YIVO moved to New York in 1941, if I'm not mistaken. The official move happened. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. And but a question that I think is interesting that digs into the people in your book is it's a question by Stephanie Nadalo. Nadalo. What was the socioeconomic status of Glacier and the other community leaders who were prominent in this period? It's an interesting question. Yeah.
So the majority of the people that were active would have been kind of working in industries, mostly at home. Leo Glaser was a lawyer. So his status was a little bit different, right? And you can even, if we're going to, judge a book by its cover, the way that he presents himself is not the same as some of the Yiddish actors in PIAT, the Parisian Yiddish avant-garde theater. So he was a little bit different, a little bit more upwardly mobile. He had also been in France since 1907, if I remember correctly, when he first arrived. So he's a little bit more he's more established. And like I said, he's an attorney also. So his status is slightly different than some of the other people who were involved in some of these groups. He's definitely to some extent an outlier.
Well, at the same time, I mean, the leaders of many of the mutual aid societies, the Landsmannschaften, I'm thinking of Israel Jeffrokin. Absolutely. He's a really important guy, and he was actually quite middle class, if not middle class plus. Yes. So I think there might be a discrepancy here to explore in terms of class between the leaders of the organizations and, as you said, the people who are actually performing on stage or the membership, the rank and file.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah, I think we need to look into these individuals. It's a really interesting question. So, okay, so I think we have time for one more question today because it is almost 1 o'clock. So let's see. Let's try to choose one. It's really tough. I have an impossible question, and maybe you can bring an answer to it, okay? Given the history, and this is from Mel Saltz, I think you get the award for the hardest question today. All right, given the history of anti-Semitism, how do we combat the current onslaught against Jews and Judaism?
It is the hardest question. Of course, we have a minute to answer it.
You might not have an answer to it. I don't know if we have an answer to this question.
I don't know if we have an answer to this question, but I actually don't necessarily think that some of the people that we're talking about from the 1920s and 1930s were necessarily wrong. I think that as we kind of, in any sort of moment when we can fight against whether it's anti-Semitism or other kind of brands of kind of xenophobia, is really to kind of position and maintain conversations about what these groups of people are and what they're doing, right? A lot of the anti-Semitism, not just in the 20s and 30s, but even now, is kind of centered around fallacious understandings of what people do, right, and where they come from, and the types of things that they're involved in. And maybe this comes from my perspective right now as an educator. I fully believe that if we kind of maintain these conversations, and if we kind of maintain an educative kind of tone, that perhaps there is a potential for us to kind of push back against some of this. Now, maybe that's naive, and I don't know, and maybe I'm thinking too much as a professor of history here at a small liberal arts college in Idaho, and that's kind of my approach that I take in this state. But maybe that's one approach to it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick, for this conversation, which was delightful. And thank you to everyone for coming and asking these great questions. I hope we can continue the conversation by reading your book.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Laura. We're so glad to have everyone join us here for this event. And as Laura was saying, if you'd like to learn more, we recommend that you check out the books by these wonderful speakers today.
Thank everyone for being here and all the questions. And, part of the idea too was that hopefully this book would spur a lot of the questions that are coming up right now. And perhaps there are other people who want to dig into some of these resources that I'm happy to share and talk about. But I really appreciate everyone being here, the time, the thoughtful questions, and just thank you to everybody. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you at the next event.